Stockfish and Komodo played in the Computer Chess Championships the other day, and the endgame that ensued was all the rage, all the discussion on social media, with everybody and their cousin having their minds blown by Stockfish's ability to generate something out of nothing in this very, very long same-color bishop ending. But before we dive into all the brilliance that was and get to the 99th move that had the world talking, I want to say that this particular position here, even for the most studious of chess experts who've been following the analysis, might bring a little bit more insight at the end of the video. The question I posed was whether Komodo at any point had a different way to try to defend the position. Was there something else to do? And the only thing I could really find starts right here, right now, on move 84, in the position with king f5 sacrificing the h5 pawn may have actually caused a little bit more trouble for Stockfish to win than first meets the eye. So we're going to come back to this and describe exactly why giving up a pawn versus taking one, as Komodo eventually did, was maybe the key defensive strategy. But without any further ado or foreshadowing, let's dive into what I deemed as the first kind of critical moment where we should start analyzing and learning from Stockfish's brilliant technique. So, on move 43, rather than making some sort of trade or heading into a drawn ending, we see the move f5 from Stockfish, and he clearly declares his intention that he wants to play this endgame on. No surprise, after bishop e8, king e3, and king e5, we see the move bishop c8, and now bishop b5. What's going to happen here over the next few minutes in the video is going to be a little bit of computer chess shuffle puck. And what I mean by that, and often wrote in my analysis, you can find it at the blog. Grandmaster Dan Boykov did a great job for Peter Docker's news report on this game. That's how great it was, a full news report on it. Is that sometimes you wonder when computers are shuffling in live fashion if it's just the contempt that has them going. Contempt, for those who don't speak computer chess, is something that programmers have put into our artificially intelligent overlords to say, don't take a draw. We want to be entertained. Play it out to the bitter, bitter end. So unless you see a variation that's completely a forced loss for you, then you should always avoid repetition. So sometimes as we see the next few moves, f6 sacrificed, obviously that makes sense to try to force the king back and gain ground. But after bishop to e2 and then takes, we get a whole lot of shuffling here. Bishop c6, bishop around, and the bishops and bishops and kings are going to shuffle for a very, very long time. The reason I didn't spend a ton of time highlighting, for example, that f6 was some brilliant sacrifice to force the king back just to get more activity with the king is, as you just saw over the next few moves, really just a lot of shuffling occurred. In fact, white willingly sacrifices back this e5 square if Komodo is man enough, so to speak, or lizard enough to take it. But Komodo doesn't need to take it, because the main thing he knows that he needs to do to blockade or draw this ending is to make sure that neither of his two biggest weaknesses, h5 or a6, fall at any point. Now, it sounds a little bit easier said than done, right? Maybe we're foreshadowing we should have seen that Stockfish had winning chances. But there's really only one way you could ever create such a scenario. And the reason I'm pausing to stop right now is because we're going to really appreciate how hard it was to get that. In the long run, if you could ever get your bishop to a square, there's only one, that attacks both a6 and h5, and somehow have the ability that also in that scenario, black was in zugzwang, meaning the king had to somehow give up the g5 square, or the bishop on a square like c8 would have to leave the pawn on a6. Without a scenario like that, you're never going to have winning chances here, right? And as we go through, we're going to see that white tries a number of different things, a whole lot of tickle, a whole lot of shuffle puck, but black is always there in time to guard the pawn and say, what you got next, big boy? The bishop checks and the king stays here. The king gets it advancing square, and at first you think, oh, we're making progress here. But no, don't get too excited. The king comes to g6, and we learn a new problem. Even if you get bishop b7, you haven't necessarily reached the ideal diagonal, because black takes that all-critical e2 square, holding both a6 and h5. So white tries to stop e2 from being an option, and black then goes back to c8. We get a bit of rinse and repeat. By the way, this position has now occurred twice, so you better come up with something new. And Stockfish tries to do that, bishop a4. The kings, again, are shuffling around. And after bishop h3, the bishop comes back, forcing the king back. Bishop a4, he doesn't want to repeat it 3 times. Only then does he come back to f4. And eventually we see the bishop try its new and ideal diagonal of hitting h5, followed by coming to e2. So now we're going to pause here and try to gather some instruction. I foreshadowed that this was the ideal position a few moments ago, right? Your bishop is on the ideal square, hitting a6 and h5. Your king is threatening entry, at least sort of bluffing at the idea that it might be able to come forward. Closer look reveals that, hey, every single one of those squares is guarded by a black piece. But at least here we can see, okay, we've got a good position for the white pieces. Now how to make black give up something. And this is really instructive because you should pause just to consider that even if you don't see a win when you play endgames like this, the way to piece together the proper plan is something that I learned from all of my coaches and trainers and can pass on, is to build a bridge or to sort of piece together a plan. You don't solve these endgames by calculating I go there, he goes there for a million moves. It's not possible. You solve them by visualizing, well, if I could get all my pieces on this square, and this square, and it was my opponent's turn, I've made progress, right? Because they're in zugzwang. Or if I could get my king here, my bishop here, my rook here, and some random ending, clearly that's progress. Even if you don't know if it's a win or not, if you have sort of pieced together the types of positions that clearly signify improvement, once you get those, something new might pop into your head, right? And that sounds crazy. We're talking about something new popping into Stockfish or Komodo's head. They don't really have one, but it is kind of what happens here. And it's almost where the contempt factor actually made him approach it like a human being. Stockfish didn't necessarily have a winning plan when it was making all of these last few moves. We saw a whole lot of rinse and repeat without any real progress, right? But at least once this position occurs, you could now clearly see, if you were the human being playing white, that, okay, even the ideal position here is not good enough. There's no way to make progress. I'm going to give checks. I'm going to try to play shuffle puck here. This almost looks like a triple step method for the bishop, which is where you move to 3 squares to try to get the same position you have here. But instead of it being white to move, you try to get the same position to be black to move. We're going to see that's what he does here. He gets that same position with black to move. Well, here's the problem. The bishop just goes to b7, right? The point is, you got this same position with black to move, and it would work if the bishop had to leave this diagonal, okay? Or if, for example, the king had to leave h6 and go here, you would lose the pawn, right? And if the king had to go to here, now you can go back to d3 and threaten bishop f5. There's no way to get there and stop the trade because that would be check. So it seems suddenly that, okay, we've got the ideal position. The triple step method work. I have the position I visualize and it's black to move. But there is no zugzwang. Black can waste. And as you give check and I move my king, you can't both be threatening to enter and have pressure on the h5 pawn at the same time. Bishop goes back and the king goes back. The king goes to e4. And the bishop goes back. So again, as we rinse and repeat this process, I don't know why I keep talking about that, probably because I need to, I don't know, switch shampoos or something. We finally get a point where we've seen no progress to be made. Coming back to any of these squares is not going to work. We should note that at no point is black ever threatening to take the d5 pawn if a6 is hanging. That's a big if. So part of the reason that the whole method I was just showing you worked is that black is actually frozen here, at least to some degree, that d5 is not capturable without a6 falling. Just to show lines like that if we want to see it and prove it. Bishop takes d5, bishop takes a6. No matter what black does, the bishop will either enter c8 or b7 next, and the pawn will start marching. One key point is that if the bishop moves, and although there you could just go to b7, I guess. If the bishop moves somewhere to prevent b7, okay, and you come here and they push, you have to make sure you have bishop b7 first as the key idea in your mind. Pushing the pawn all the way to a7, you'll never have a chance to help it again, which is just an instructive way to queen corner pawns when you have same color bishops. I wanted to show you. Got a little off track there, but sorry, the chess teacher in me sometimes takes a hold. And I wanted to make sure you understand that if you got this pawn, the threat is bishop b7, and then you advance, not anything else. So that's a good example of why d5 is not being taken because of a6, and white will always win that race. But with the shuffle that occurred, we got this position where it seems like nothing new is being done. Are we ready finally to agree that it's enough contempt with the contempt and just agree to a draw? No, Stockfish has something else. King to d2. Now this was the first move I really gave as an exclam, because at the very least it showed how a human would think. You got this sort of ideal position with the king and bishop, no progress to be made. In order to keep the game alive, we might as well make an exchange, reset all of those 3-move repetition ideas so there's no draw. Also, you reset the 50-move rule, not that that was really a threat, but you do that. And eventually you've changed the structure enough that you can go back and try to find something new. Players who try to win these drawn endings have to be stubborn. They have to keep fighting when, even if there's a little part of them inside that says, this is probably just a draw. You don't give in to that voice. You push and you dictate your opponent until they get under time pressure and eventually beat themselves. That's just random Georgian Grandmaster advice, right? Okay, so we reached the position that I'm going to show after the video. King to b3. I think that in hindsight, what we've now learned is, despite all of my sort of trying to take the slightly pessimistic tone, I'm an entertainer trying to twist ending you to say, no, this really was just a draw. I actually think that at this point, White does have a threat of a winning plan. And having analyzed it really deeply, I don't think Komodo could have done anything different than perhaps right here, right now, with the immediate abandonment of the H-pawn and trying for a new blockade. So I will circle back and show the idea that isn't so obvious here in a little bit. But first, let's get back to our position that we saw, and stop teasing us, Dan. Let's get the exact same position you saw. Why is it any different now, right? A lot of shuffle puck, a lot of moves. We get back to the exact same position we had right here. We had already seen this position a few times. King goes, you move, the king moves. We've now seen this position, whether the bishop was on c8 or the king was on h6 enough times, right? If the bishop goes back to e2, we're going to see the move king to g6. And with check, the king can come back. If the bishop continues to wait, this bishop can continue to wait on this diagonal. So without anything new to show, you haven't really made any progress yet as Stockfish. But this is the move that blew everybody's mind. And in hindsight, we're going to say that not only was it brilliant, I don't think it was just based on some sort of random contempt later by Komodo losing a drawn position. I think that Black is actually lost after the double exclam bishop f5. Giving up the d5 pawn, but not in a position where you can win the a6 pawn back right away. That's the key. Every other position before, you can go through the whole video, whenever the d5 pawn was hanging, a6 would have always come with it. And this position was the first time that Stockfish realizes, however you want to talk about how an artificially intelligent being comes to think, that he doesn't need the d5 pawn. What's amazing is that one of the things this shows is that two weaknesses are often more important than one, right? We know that, right? Thanks for the memo, Captain Obvious. But it does show that the idea is that just because you give up your weakness doesn't mean that those two weaknesses have gone away. So what I'm saying is you still have the chance to win both weaknesses. And what you start to realize is that this d5 pawn, if it's actually impinging on your ability to gang up or to put your opponent in a zugzwang where those weaknesses are not defensible, then why do you need it, right? In endgames, one principle should always hold true. It's not how many pawns you have, but who queens first. And as you look at those pawns, you realize that they have one thing in common. They're both corner pawns. They're both rook pawns. Those are the hardest pawns to stop in chess endgames, right? Because they're completely separate from each other. Central pawns are often the easiest pawns to stop because you can reach them from both sides of the board. And if you have a centralized king, which White does, you're almost never in real danger of that pawn becoming a queen. So bishop f5 is translated as, well, you don't need it, and you're probably not risking losing anyway, so you might as well go for it. Bishop takes d5 is played because what else? If the king retreats in any kind of way, the white king can enter into g5. Moving the bishop to a8 would immediately allow bishop to c8. So this is quite literally the only move. Bishop takes d5. This is the real shock. I almost found this move just as funny as bishop f5. The bishop goes right back to d3. So you played the move bishop f5 to give up the d5 pawn, and then you go right back to d3. And what? What have you done now? The bishop comes to c4, and after the king goes to g6, we get bishop e2. This is the exact same position we had just a few moments ago, except the d5 pawn is gone. How in the world is it possible that this has improved your winning chances? Well, after bishop to c8, we see the move bishop f3, and it suddenly starts to come to light. Without the d5 pawn, you actually have access that you didn't before. Note that there really isn't any better ways for black to try to hold. I've analyzed a few of them here for you, so let's see. Pushing the d-pawn in an attempt to keep the bishop here simply allows the move king to e5. And as we're going to see in a lot of variations here that do get kind of complicated, once the king enters, your king can be pushed back, and this a6 pawn is a much bigger problem than almost anything else that black can drum up. So entering into e5 is a real threat, and black doesn't want to allow it. Moving the king away from the h-pawn blunders the h-pawn. Moving the king to h6 would allow king f5. So we're just going move by move here to make sure we've established that every move played was forced by Komodo. Bishop c8, now bishop f3. The bishop comes to f5 because coming to a new diagonal to defend does make a lot of sense. And so black is not going to get to that diagonal, says white, king e3. Bishop to c8, and now king to d4. And here we get the move bishop to g4. We're going to circle back to this one along with the line that I think is Komodo's best drawing chances here in a minute, because I did spend a lot of time trying to prove that black could not just sit tight. This is a key idea because it does say that you can't go to d5 right away. You would actually lose your bishop. So white does have to come up with what I kind of figured out is maybe the only move that wins here, or at least the only move that has a winning plan. Other moves just rinse and repeat the same position. So we'll come back to king h6. But bishop g4 was played. And after the move bishop e4 check, the king moves, we see that the reason black played king g6 and bishop g4 is because it doesn't want to sit with the king on h6. It now has officially agreed, I need to run and abandon ship and get to the queen side as fast as possible. Why? Because here's what happens in the game. Bishop d3, king to c8. If the bishop had gone to c8, now black has no skewer. On bishop b7, there's no skewer to win the bishop. King to e7 is met by king to c6. And after the move d5, you have the amazing move king to c7. This is the only move that wins. You don't take the pawn and allow the black king to get closer. Instead, you play king to c7 and force the bishop out of its favorite square, after which you can take a6, and the a pawn, along with the fact that the king is shielding the king from the queen side, is much faster than anything black has. These are the type of lines that I think best illustrate kind of the brilliance of the sacrifice, right? It's not just that it started with this move bishop f3 to take the diagonal of the bishop, but the fact that the d5 square becomes an entry point for the king to walk in if black tries his best to hold on to the pawn. We don't even need to try to win our pawn back. It's all about the right king position and making sure that that weakness I couldn't get at before is finally falling. So this is a line that really shows that idea. Instead, in the game, after bishop d3, black played king e8, and after bishop takes a6, king to d8, we see king e4, king c7, bishop b5, and we immediately start to realize just how lost black is. Dual threats here, not just of advancing the a-pawn, but also king f4, king g5, and bishop to e8 are enough to make black panic. After king to b8, king f4, black does indeed do so. He plays, not yet, he plays king c7, but after bishop e8, he realizes he can't just sit around anymore and shuffle the king, and he finally plays d5, allowing Stockfish to come back into the center. King e5, bishop f3, the bishop goes back to b5, and the point is that the white king is improving itself enough to come and make sure the a-pawn will finish the job. Again, this whole line, which is what happened in the game, just shows you it's the power of the pawn, not who had the pass pawn first, I guess, and the fact that there's a check here just to show you the line doesn't do anything. The king can come right back and take, and you think you've achieved opposition, and now what do? You got to go right back to guard it, and white's just going to come right back just like in the game. So d4 wouldn't have done anything. King a7 was played, bishop d3, king to b6, and ultimately we get a position where the dual threats of a7 combined with the fact that you still have not taken care of that second weakness we talked about long ago makes the endgame impossible to hold. Bishop a6, and black is in full zugzwang. The bishop cannot stay guarding the checkmate on b7 and guard the d3 pawn. So he plays d2, but now on bishop e2, we see the same thing. The bishop has no ability to both guard the h5 pawn and guard the threat of bishop f3 checkmate at the same time. So classic Komodo fashion, gets a knight. Again, but just to show, it doesn't matter. You move anywhere else, bishop f3 is checkmate in 2. If you move the bishop on this diagonal, I keep an eye on the d1 square, pick up that pawn, and then start to march Harry up the board. So there was no choice but to do what was done. And this is really, I'm only showing you the end of this game because apparently we've learned that a lot of people like seeing checkmate on the board. So might as well make that happen, right? Let's show the checkmate all the way out. But this particular position does show the threat, I guess, and it's going to help us as we back up and go into what were the other options Komodo had. We now understand that winning the a-pawn, even if it's a 2 versus 2 battle, A and H versus D and H, is enough for white to win. So if giving up the a-pawn was not the best idea for black, what if instead of this king rush over, we already saw that trying to guard the pawn here was not good enough, right? The king could enter. What if instead of rushing the king over in the beginning, black decided to keep his king on this side of the board? All the way back to the line I analyzed, instead of bishop g4, which allowed the line we saw with check and bishop d3, right, which ultimately led to the pawn, black just sits tight and plays king h6. I think this is actually some of the most instructive stuff to show why the endgame is winning. King d5 does not work. It's a skewer. Moving the bishop, let's see. Lines I've analyzed like bishop e2 allow bishop e7. Now the bishop guards both the pawn and the king entry. If you move the bishop somewhere else, at this point, the king might even consider getting active. So sitting tight but leaving this diagonal is not ideal. You can't enter here right away, and you also want to keep an eye on the pawn. So the only way to do that is to move bishop to c6. This move stops the threat of a skewer, prepares king d5, and does keep an eye on the h-pawn via a new diagonal of e8. So you basically solve the problem. You couldn't advance as long as there was a threat of a skewer, right? But you can advance with the bishop still keeping the king trapped and now no longer a threat of the skewer. Time for black to panic. There's a lot of moves here, and again, I encourage you to check out all of them over at the blog to see why it's winning by force. But I'm going to go with the ones that feel the most important and instructive to prove white's winning. King coming back to g6 makes a lot of sense. Again, here note that bishop e6 to stop king d5 would just allow bishop e7, and the pawn does fall because bishop c4 is not a possibility. We've already established losing the a pawn is the fastest pawn on the board. That's why we kind of Tarantino'd this and showed you the ending. So we shouldn't have to look at lines where white just wins the a6 pawn anymore. It's too fast. So instead, we see king g6, bishop e8 check, forcing the king back, and now the king comes in. Now, even in this line where it looks clear doomsday, d6 is going to fall and we're going to come over, only the right plan for white is going to win. And I'm going to let you pause the video here to see if you want to try to come up with it. Not much time because we're already kind of hitting that 20-minute mark of a very, very long lesson and lecture that hopefully you're enjoying. The only way to have a very forceful win here for white is to move king to e5. Now, let me show you what happens in variations where you just run the king over. Seems like this should be an easy win, right? We're way too fast. We're going to bring the bishop and win the a6 pawn. What could black do? Make sure you know your king and pawn endings, kids. King to d5 is a draw. The whole point is that bishop takes a6, allows bishop takes and king to c6, and we have the king trapped on the edge of the board. At this point, even giving a check would not matter. The king goes to d6. Any trade always allows the trap. If you go back, I go back. If you move the king, I come in. So suddenly we see a line that, as crazy as it looks, black is actually corner to corner fast enough to have a theoretical draw because of what we know about corner pawns. King to e5, on the other hand, says that I'm going to make sure I prioritize the right thing, which is keeping your king imprisoned while I improve this bishop. And only once my bishop is in the ideal spot will I then abandon and run to get the pawn. That line is shown in a variation like this. Bishop to b7, king to g. Now that we've improved it, the bishop is 2 tempi ahead. The king, okay, actually, if the king ever comes back, that's the other reason king e5 is good. If the king ever comes back, you now bring the king over and win the h-pawn. Positions like this are just a matter of time. The bishop will come over and win h5. You have no counterplay at all, and the h-pawn will be way too fast for anything on this side of the board. Not to mention the fact that the pawn is still in a light square means maybe white actually has a better chance to win it than black. So one of the other key points of king e5 is it not just prepares to shoulder the king, which is one of those awesome geometry lessons where we don't just run for a pawn and let the king out, right? But it also says if you do try to run your king out prematurely, this is the key, that I will switch pawns and forget a6 and go for h5 with my king on g5. You guys can tell how excited I'm freaking getting about this endgame because it's amazing. I mean, honestly, this part of it, I spent so much time analyzing this because I just couldn't get my head around why this was a forced win. But again, with the right technique, you emphasize and prioritize the right things. If the king leaves his blockade too early, I'll win the easier pawn. If he stays tight and the bishop keeps moving, I will only then improve my bishop enough that if the bishop continues to move like this, only now, I've gained essentially 3 moves, do I abandon this side of the board, run to the b pawn, and I'm way ahead of the tempi now. Obviously here, the variation I gave was king g4 because, I mean, if you run this way, you're actually just way behind, right? You're not in a position, the king needs to jump from e5 to c6, but kings don't move like ponies. So without the ability to get to c6, you're just dead in the water. So in this line I just show, so at that point you might as well try to run to this side of the board, but again, way too slow. The pawn advances, bishop e7, a7, a8, queen. Bob's your uncle. For those that are really into play like Karpov technique, I'm pretty sure I also analyzed bishop f3 instead of king b6 here is also winning. If you just want to say, like, you know what, I'm not even going to let you have the satisfaction of winning the pawn for free. I'll get it and then go all the way back to the a pawn. But the main variation I gave, and as far as the critical reason why king e5 wins and why this idea of prioritizing both weaknesses is why this endgame is winning, is why the move king h6 back here, instead of what was played in the game by Komodo, bishop g4, also would have lost the game. So as long as Stockfish didn't fall for the skewer, he would have lost. I could keep going on and on about this, and the analysis is super complicated right here. Doing my best to make sure I highlight all the variations that I promised myself I would. And on that note, I want to go back to the foreshadowing of the beginning of the video. And scrolling up, we're going to go back to this position where instead of the move that was played, it's possible that the one drawing chance, I'm going to find the move number right now. Apologies for that. The one drawing chance might have been right here. So to refresh your memory, what did we see? We saw a deadlock in terms of the blockade. White couldn't break through until this b4 idea. One other point I want to show, actually, is why didn't the d5 pawn sack work in this position? Okay, why doesn't the d5 pawn sack work before you've traded the b pawn? I'll show that. Good question. The main point is that if you try for, instead of sitting tight, keeping your eye on the a6 pawn, right, which was the main reason d5 couldn't be taken, if you go for Stockfish's bishop f5 idea before the b pawn has been traded for the c pawn, the main problem is that now on takes and you try to come back, black has c4. Stopping the bishop from hitting a6, and after the bishop moves and the d-pawn gets rolling, I'm not even sure who's better in a position like bishop e2, bishop f7. Probably white is maybe not losing, but I actually don't know. So just to answer the question that may or may not have been asked in your head is, why was it necessary to start this whole plan of bringing the king back and over to the queen side before you sacrifice the d-pawn? That's why, because if you gave up the pawn and allowed that bishop to block the diagonal, white would never have the chance to do what it did in the game, where ultimately we came back to this bishop f5 position, if you remember. And again, we gave up the d-pawn and forced the bishop back instead of a pawn coming to c4. So that answers that question. The last question I posed at the beginning of the video is really a key point to try to understand this endgame. In this position right here, right now, was there an opportunity for black to find out or realize to himself an anti-counterintuitive computer style that he needs to give up material to try to hold? When you don't see a winning path for your opponent, I wouldn't recommend this for human or computer, right? It's very difficult to change gears of just sitting tight when you're like, what's the point of, what are you doing, right? But in hindsight, this position offers one very instructive drawing idea I wanted to show. If you play king f5 and white takes, and then you play king e5, one of the key ideas is that after the move, for example, bishop f3 to guard the pawn, black can play king f4, bishop moves, and king back to e5. And the main idea is that if white tries to advance the h-pawn, black doesn't take d5, but goes back to the dark squares, and suddenly we see the same blockade that had been held here for the last several moves on the board. The pawn guards e5, the bishop guards f5, and the king guards g5. King to g5 threatens bishop f5 check, not allowing king f4. And after the bishop moves, we check the king back, and you can rinse and repeat. Anytime the king is not threatening to come to f4, the king can go back. Anytime the bishop is attacking the pawn, the bishop can go back. As soon as you come up to g5, you're threatening bishop f5 check. King backs up here, you can even go to f5, because if h6, you gather the pawn. And as I showed, in lines like this, I actually could not find a clear way in for white. The pawns guard key entry points, and the king and bishop do the same job they've been doing since before the d-pawn was sacrificed. So I spent a lot of time analyzing this, and I couldn't find a way that white creates a zugzwang, which would need to be this position with black to move. But the problem is even that doesn't work. It's just like before. It's not that the bishop even has b7. The bishop has f5 check. And you can force even if it was black to move, you can check, force the king back, and then go right back. So this particular blockading setup of giving up the h-pawn, I think might have been Komodo's last chance to draw. Very difficult to see, though it is instructive to kind of think about the blockade you have and don't give up on it so early. However, after analyzing that, I came up with the idea that white has. And of course, it was obvious in hindsight. I don't need the d-pawn. I've already won the h-pawn, just like the idea that Stockfish came up with. You just give up the pawn with king to c3. And after takes, you play bishop g6 and only then rush the h-pawn, as now, for example, in variations like this, you might blockade my pawn, but you haven't stopped my winning plan that I used in the game of entering on the d-file. So instead, I analyzed d5 as a natural way to try to stop that, but now we can force the king back. h7 was also winning, but once the king has left, we get to go right back to the same plan white had all along, which is to ultimately win the a6 pawn. I'll just show it just for kicks and giggles, just to remind everybody I don't even want the d pawn. The whole point is you're getting this bishop away and only then taking and ultimately winning because of the a pawn. So I teased you at the beginning of the video, was king f5 the only chance Komodo had to draw? The answer is no. The endgame was winning the entire time, especially once this b4 idea was shown. But I do think that last little instructive blockade that black has might be something that's worth noting, especially when we consider in hindsight that there really was no way to deal with this super brilliant sacrifice of the d-pawn once black did allow white to come all the way back over here to the king side. So I've never spent more time analyzing an endgame by myself, myself, and some chess engines on my chess base, let alone trying to really understand an endgame than I did here. One endgame that from start to finish did not optically look winning, but in the end, we learned something about two weaknesses being more important than one, even to the point where you can lose your weakness, not as a trade for one, but straight up, if it means that those two weaknesses don't go anywhere and you're given new avenues to put your opponent under pressure. That's really what we could summarize on a high level of what Stockfish did. It is Zugzwang at its finest, but not in the obvious sense as we normally think of it. Creating new avenues for both the king and the bishop by sacrificing that d-pawn, were what that move 99 bishop f5, the move 99 bishop f5 double exclam that will be remembered forever, I guess, really was all about. Just backing up to show it one last time on the board. Something that will forever be remembered. So hope you enjoyed it. If you did, click on one of these other videos here from our channel and keep watching chess content. Apologize for the slightly longer lecture than normal, but as a chess fan, I felt that I had to do this game justice and really try to understand it. I even bounced around some, as you could see, making sure that as I remembered a key idea, I took the time to go over it. So maybe now you take a look at this and you click that blog below. Come on, click on my blog and go check it out. If you want to understand even more about it, I think we can all become better chess players when we see masterpieces like this one. So thank you so much, and I will see you around on Chess.com.